This is WAB's Week in Review with me, Alex Helmick. On this show, we take a look back at the last few days to hear stories from your WABE news team. In just a couple minutes, we'll go to the Capitol and talk about gambling, in vitro fertilization, and more as we head to Crossover Day. And we look at the impact decisions in D.C. are having here in Georgia. But first, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens touted strides addressing crime and affordable housing during the final State of the City address before his re-election bid later this year. So far, he has no challengers. WABE's Sam Greenglass reported the story.
Dickens told a crowd of VIPs at the Woodruff Art Center that he inherited a fractured city in need of course correction. But over 4 years, Dickens faced challenges like the Buckhead secession threat, protests against a public safety training center, and bungling communication during a days-long water outage.
When they tried to tear our city in two, we fought back and kept our city whole. When they tried to stop Cop City, we fought back and built the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. And when they try to tell us that diversity and inclusion are something to run away from, we will fight back and show them that our diversity is what makes us strongest.
The mayor also highlighted efforts to revitalize downtown, curb food insecurity, and add green space. Sam Greenglass, WABE News.
After more than a year in limbo, a federal appeals court says a case related to a possible referendum on Atlanta's Public Safety Training Center could be dismissed as moot. WABE's Shemaine Cruz had that story.
The 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals is asking all parties to weigh in, given that construction of the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center is nearly complete. The city of Atlanta argues the issue is moot, but lawyers for 4 non-Atlanta residents who helped collect signatures in a petition drive to force a referendum in the summer of 2023 say that the case is still alive for 2 main reasons. First, the referendum seeks to repeal a city ordinance and 50-year lease to the Atlanta Police Foundation for the construction of the center. Second, the question of whether the district court erred in allowing them to participate based on their First Amendment rights. A ruling for either side would likely kill the effort or send the case back to the district court. Shemaine Cruz, WABE News.
Well, next Thursday is a big one at the state capitol. It's known as Crossover Day, a key deadline for bills to advance out of at least one chamber of the legislature. On this week's episode of Plugged In, hosts Sam Greenglass and Raul Bali discuss where some big ticket items stand ahead of Crossover Day.
Typically, lawmakers work late into the night, sometimes after midnight, but remember, there's still a shot for bills to become law, even if it doesn't make this deadline. The text can be inserted into another bill in the same code section. We've got all sorts of colorful names for it. Zombie bills, Frankenstein bills, ghost bills, vehicles, whatever you want to call them.
Right, but for now, let's start by talking about legislation that won't be needing the zombie bill treatment. These are bills that have already cleared at least one chamber ahead of Crossover Day. So lawmakers moved swiftly to ban transgender girls from playing on girls' sports teams. This week, the Senate passed legislation to curb state regulations, which Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones says complements efforts by President Trump and Elon Musk to slash the government's footprint. That bill, SB 28, would require state agencies to review all rules every 4 years and give the legislature more power to block new ones. And most notably, the Georgia Senate has also advanced Kemp's top legislative priority, overhauling civil litigation rules, an effort you'll often hear referred to as tort reform.
And Sam, here's a notable bill that has cleared the House ahead of Crossover Day, codifying protections for in vitro fertilization, or IVF. So this is partially in response to an Alabama Supreme Court ruling last year that defined embryos as children that led to a temporary interruption of IVF services in Alabama. House Bill 428 adds this sentence to Georgia law, quote, individuals have a right to obtain in vitro fertilization. Look, you've been hearing a lot of personal stories around IVF, which includes the bill's lead sponsor, Republican State Representative Lehman Franklin. He and his wife were struggling to have a child. They're now expecting their first through the help of IVF. Franklin talked about his bill on the House floor Thursday.
If you have concerns about the issues surrounding this, or you have ideas about it, or you don't know where you stand, you don't have to worry about this, because this bill doesn't go near it. It doesn't go anywhere to touch it. All it does is codify it and put it in the law. So you can all rest easy and vote yes on this bill and feel good about it.
And of course, we should note that just because a bill passed one chamber does not mean it will be smooth sailing on the other side. Okay, so we've been talking about legislation that has already cleared one chamber ahead of crossover day. Now let's talk about some of the bills that have not surmounted this important threshold yet, but we know are priorities of at least one chamber, so they're likely to get a move on in the coming days. House Speaker John Burns has said one of his top priorities is moving a huge bill focused on school safety following the deadly school shooting last fall at Appalachia High School. That bill has a lot of complexities that need to be ironed out, so that doesn't leave a lot of time for it to clear the House next week.
Okay, Sam, so let's talk about the bills that the future may not be as bright. There's not much movement or not much time for action by next Thursday. You know, Sam, one of the questions I get every year is what's going on with gambling? I keep hearing that there's a very narrow bill in the works that would put legalization of online sports betting on the ballot as a constitutional amendment referendum. The money would go to the Hope Scholarship and pre-K programs. There is Senate Resolution 131, which would allow casino gambling and other forms of gambling. But the challenge there is getting a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate to get it on the ballot.
All right, so I'm going to select the bill that you could probably pick for this category every session, Democrats' perennial push to fully expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. There was some excitement from Democrats at the beginning of this session when they rolled out a bill with 4 Republican co-sponsors. But Kemp has, of course, made his opposition to full expansion very clear, and the Democrats' bill has not gotten even a committee hearing yet.
And you can follow these bills and more at wabe.org/2025 bill tracker. And be sure to listen to the full conversation of Plugged In. It's released every Friday morning, wherever you get your pods. You're listening to WAB's Week in Review with me, Alex Hummick. If you haven't checked out our multi-story series called Missing Moms, looking at Georgia's maternal health crisis, in recent stories, Jess Mador looked at maternal mental health of moms and moms-to-be as they go through such a life-changing event.
We still stigmatize mental health care to such a huge degree, especially when there's a baby concerned. The focus is mostly on the baby and not on the mom.
My mental health was the most important thing for me during this pregnancy and postpartum.
When my son was born, I would just stay up all night and stare at him to make sure he was breathing.
Even if you come out of a pregnancy physically healthy, it doesn't so much matter if you're so down that you can't get out of bed in the morning.
It's just like it takes over you. There's no hiding it because it's like a constant repetitive thought.
This isn't talked about in my community. We pray it away, or we just don't discuss it at all. I should be grateful I have the baby and just move on. Why can't you get over it?
And with my second child, I noticed that I started really having feelings of paranoia. People watching us or following us, wanting to take my kids. I asked my husband, I called him on the way home and said, someone's calling me home from Kroger. They followed me around the whole grocery store. They put an air tag on my car. Can you wait outside with a gun? He knew something was off at that point.
I know how rocky and how tough it is. Waking up and feeding a baby is easy. Being mentally available is the hard part.
I feel like there's a stigma around mental health and taking medication. I cannot even describe to you how much it changed me once I started taking the medication. And how much I felt like a totally different person in what the medication did for me.
I think we really need to change the conversation around mental health so that people are getting the support that they deserve and that they need during and after pregnancy.
And just having that help and support to know that you're not alone. I have to be okay so they can be okay.
More on that at wab.org/missingmoms. Let's turn now to a couple stories looking at how D.C. is impacting ATL. The Trump administration has sought deep cuts to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency born out of a crisis that decimated many Atlanta neighborhoods. WABE's Stephanie Stokes revisited the local effects of the housing crash then to understand what's at stake now.
Given how much the housing market has grown in Atlanta, it can be hard to remember how things were just 15 to 20 years ago. The region was in the middle of a devastating foreclosure crisis.
Dreams are shattered on the courthouse steps.
It was all over TV news, like WSB.
Georgia ranks near the top of the list when it comes to foreclosures.
This list of more than 5,000 foreclosures just for the next few weeks in 12 metro counties.
According to Georgia State University professor Dan Immergluck, Atlanta was one of the hardest hit cities. He says the housing disaster here traced back to poor regulation.
The whole regulatory regime for mortgages was buyer beware.
Homeowners had to read the fine print, but many didn't, or they didn't understand it, and they ended up with risky, high-cost mortgages called subprime loans. Immergluck says the areas in Atlanta with the most foreclosures had the most of these kinds of loans.
As soon as you saw subprime lending go up, within a year, you would see an increase in foreclosures.
Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because of this regulatory problem. Among its powers, the Bureau forced lenders to bear some of the risk of high-cost loans. But today, the Trump White House has argued it's a, quote, woke, weaponized arm of bureaucracy. The administration has closed the Bureau offices indefinitely. Experts like Immergluck say Atlanta's experience in the last crisis shows how high the costs can be.
A lot of households never recovered, and a lot of communities never recovered.
Many have never owned a home again. Stephanie Stokes, WABE News.
In a few weeks, hikers will arrive in Springer Mountain, Georgia to start the Appalachian Trail. But this year, the nonprofit supporting the famous hiking path says federal firings may hinder trail maintenance and improvement work. WABE's Marissa Mecki had the details.
Maintaining the 2,000-mile trail for the 4 million-plus hikers who visit it yearly is a huge job. It's handled by a network of nonprofits and volunteer groups, state agencies, and the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service.
The simple footpath actually is protected and maintained through a very complicated system.
Sandy Mara is president of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. She says they were already facing challenges after Hurricane Helene did serious damage to the trail, roads, and other infrastructure. But now, key federal partners like the Park Service and Forest Service are losing staff. And Mara says her nonprofit is unclear on the future of federal funding. Money that typically pays for staff and volunteer training, shelter repairs, hazard tree removal, and more. She says near-term projects in Georgia do still have funding, but
the bottom line to all of this, with this uncertainty, right now, ATC feels that to be safe and protect our full-time employees, we're postponing all of our seasonal hiring right now.
that includes everyone from people on the ground doing trail maintenance to educators who help visitors appreciate the nature along the path. Marissa Mecki, WABE News.
A group of Baptist churches based in Georgia won a preliminary injunction this week that prevents federal immigration agents from making arrests in their places of worship. A federal judge blocked the president's policy change Monday. As WABE's Melissa Fado reports, they're not the only religious group here to seek that protection.
The Cooperative Baptist Fellowship joined a federal lawsuit earlier this month in response to the Trump administration ending the sensitive locations policy, which deterred immigration authorities from operating in and around places like schools, hospitals, and places of worship. A Maryland federal judge granted a preliminary injunction while the case plays out, but the stop only applies to the handful of plaintiffs. A separate but similar lawsuit filed in Washington, D.C., in part by the North Georgia Conference of United Methodists, also seeks to stop immigration enforcement activities in churches. The churches say the federal government is violating their religious freedoms. Government lawyers say the churches are asking the court to interfere with law enforcement. Melissa Fato, WABE News.
And we'll switch gears for the final story for today. An historic black church in Atlanta, once led by civil rights leader Ralph David Abernathy, is receiving a grant to preserve its building. As WABE's Julian Virgin explained, the funding is part of a nationwide effort to preserve and protect black places of worship.
Historic black churches are some of the oldest institutions in America.
They are repositories of culture,
of social impact, and of faith.
That's Brent Legs, the executive director of the Action Fund, dedicated to preserving historic African-American sites across the country. Legs says these institutions are critical to understanding American history. That's why the organization is giving more than $8 million to 30 historical Black churches facing preservation threats.
Like insufficient funding, deferred maintenance, environmental contamination, and even threats of vacancy.
Like Atlanta's West Hunter Street Baptist Church, the current building, with columns resembling that of a Greek temple and colorful stained glass windows, has stood in the West End neighborhood since 1952.
There's a lot of wear and tear on this building.
Reverend Cedric Von Jackson is the current pastor. He says the church received a $200,000 grant, which would be used to hire a preservation manager to plan future restoration projects.
This is going to allow us to do some things that on our own we just could not do.
Jackson admits it's becoming increasingly difficult to depend on their loyal but relatively small and aging congregation to make ends meet. But he says it's critical the church remains intact because
we would not be where we are without the Black church. And if the Black church does not survive, I don't think the Black race could survive.
The grant funds will be spread across a 3-year period. Julian Virgin, WABE News.
That's all for the show this week. My thanks to the WABE News team for all the great work. Check us out at WABE.org for more. I'm Alex Helmick. Thank you for supporting WABE and listening to the Week in Review.